objective to approach climate change as an ethical issue, but that's just too long for a poster, so this is what it came down to. So obviously climate change includes a lot of different aspects and a lot of ways to approach it. And what I'm going to talk to you about today are 3 different ways that we can approach climate change as an ethical issue. So science, of course, is fundamental to understanding what's going on with climate change. But science is limited in the sense that it can tell us what has been in the past, what is, and maybe project a little bit about what might be. But science doesn't tell us what we should do about these things that it observes. And of course, we know that the world is warming and that CO2 levels are rising. This is one projection. You can get projections going back 800,000 years based on ice cores. But just looking at this, you see the world has been largely at 56.5 average degrees for Fahrenheit, and that the significant rise has come very recently, in the very recent past, along with the rise in carbon dioxide. And there are many, many such graphs like this out there. A lot of this is just measurement, so not a lot of controversy about these sorts of things. And then when we look at more recent temperatures, we definitely see the trajectory going up. And recent years have been record warm, of course. Virtually every year in the 21st century has been warmer than any year in the 20th century. And we know that some areas are more vulnerable to climate change than others. Obviously, we think about the coasts, and especially delta areas, such as Bangladesh, which is really almost entirely, the entire country, is about 5 meters above sea level, more or less. And when you look at this territory, don't think that this is somehow uninhabited or unimportant. In fact, these are areas of great habitation and very productive areas also in terms of agriculture. So even just 1 meter sea level rise, which scientists are pretty confident we're going to see by the end of the century, is going to be of significance and cause real problems in a place like Bangladesh. Whereas here, where we live, up on a plateau, we don't really have a lot to directly be concerned about with sea level rise. So we have this unevenness in terms of climate effects. So again, the current situation where we are right now is about 1 degree Celsius temperature rise. That has the effect of increasing the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. So a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor. And the result of more water vapor is, in fact, more rain, more heavy rain events, and the result of higher temperatures is more drought. Now, what this means is that there are winners and losers, of course. And so it's possible that things like areas in northern Canada where you could not grow wheat, you could grow wheat. So there are possible winners in this. But when there are losers, such as we had with a huge set of wildfires in Russia several years ago that wiped out a third of the wheat crop, the result of this were people who are spending most of their money on food, which is not what most Americans do, right? People who are spending most of their money on food find this increase in prices, which were worldwide, not just in Russia, to be really problematic. And so that question of who suffers from these changes. The same thing actually happened with the peanut crop here in the US. There was a drought. Again, peanut butter grows. If you buy a jar of peanut butter every couple of weeks and you're not really worried about the 30-cent increase in your peanut butter, you're fine. But if you're living week to week in terms of paycheck, then that rise in peanut butter, that rise in commodities prices can be very significant. So in addition to what scientists think is pretty sure to happen, there is the possibility of outliers, of tipping points. And the recent IPCC report really warned us that some of these tipping points may be coming much earlier than we suspect. So if we're going to just pay attention to what the science is telling us, not talking about ethics yet, we really need to pay attention to the possibility that the rise in temperature and the rise in sea level may be catastrophic already by 2100. Interestingly, if you look farther out, which again does not generally make the newspaper because people don't generally think they care about 2500, but I care about 2500, then we start seeing something quite different, a much greater certainty of sea level rise up to, say, 50 feet, for example, by dates further out. So the farther we get out in terms of our timeline, the greater the certainty about some of these events happening, especially if we don't do anything about our carbon emissions. So again, think about Bangladesh. Think about what a 1 meter versus a 5 meter sea level rise means for somebody who is living in this delta. And think about the people who live there, who can no longer live there. Already, some of the sea level rise we're seeing, which is really on the border of 7 or 8 inches, maybe a foot, some of this sea level rise is already causing areas to become too saline and cannot support agriculture anymore. And already people are starting to move away from coasts. But imagine the migrations that will happen if this actually occurs. So these are the sorts of things we need to keep in mind and that science can pretty much tell us we're in for. Now, science is, and I hang out with scientists a lot. I started off in chemical engineering at Purdue. I nearly was a scientist myself at one point. I saw the light turn to history. But scientists are a funny crowd, and the conviction among scientists is that we'll raise the alarm, and then people will do the right thing, right? So already in the 50s, scientists started to become concerned about rising CO2 levels, given the increase in car culture in the US. World War II, of course, was run largely on fossil fuels, and they started to see levels rise. So they established then an observatory on Mauna Loa to get a good readout of what carbon dioxide levels were. And so we have pretty good evidence now about exactly what carbon dioxide levels have done over the past 50 years. Some of these scientists got together, contacted President Johnson back in 1965. I'm one of the few people who was alive back then, in 1965. Okay, so several of us, okay, good. And who reported then about this to Congress. Amazing that this actually happened, okay. So at this point it was still speculative, and the National Academy of Sciences was tasked with making a report, which they did in 1983, a report on the changing climate. They pushed for the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which then in 1990 produced their first report establishing that climate change is happening and that it's largely human caused. And how many here have been born since 1990? So who was born after 1990? Yeah, okay, so mostly the whole room. Okay. So for all of your lives, we have known that climate change scientists have established, have done peer-reviewed, careful research to establish this causation. Action happened. There was a Rio summit, the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 that did in fact call for worldwide action. President Bush, the first, attended. Look up his speech sometime, it's available on YouTube. Where he says, we're going to do something. We're going to solve this problem. We're going to put American creativity to work and do something about this. And in fact, the US Senate ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, in 1992. So we've come a long way since 1992. And again, the expectation of scientists was that they would raise the alarm, they would do their science, they would inform the politicians, who then would do the right thing. But politics is run by short-term interests, not long-term interests. Politics is based on the 2-year or 4-year election cycle. In a sense, there are 6 years, but they're still run by this. Other important parties, like the fossil fuel companies, asserted their views, started to sow uncertainty and to raise questions about the science, to the point that today, more than abortion, more than euthanasia, climate change is the most divisive issue in the US today. You can tell a person's political party affiliation by how they stand on climate change. Whereas if you ask them about gun rights, you're not quite sure. Ask them about the death penalty, you might be wrong. You'll be more wrong than you are on climate change. So this is a real problem because the shift in terms of, remember George H.W. Bush was a Republican president, right? So this was signed under a Republican administration. So it used to be quite different. So why do I think this is an ethical issue? And again, there are three ways I think we can look at this. On the one hand, we have the issue of duties and obligations. This is a matter of justice. It's looking at the fact that we signed this treaty, we have duties under this treaty according to US and international law, and we need to fulfill those duties. That's an ethical argument based on contract theory, respect for persons, what you expect to deal with when you're talking with another person. You expect them to tell the truth, that if they say they're going to do something, then they do it. So these are certainly ways of looking at this. And the person who's really spearheaded this sort of ethical analysis is Don Brown. He has a book called Navigating the Perfect Moral Storm, Climate Change, right? So, and this issue about, and he actually himself was a negotiator for the Clinton administration with the UN on climate change, and it focuses on this question of duties and what we should have done and what we should be doing. Now, with this way of looking at things, of course, we're talking primarily about human beings. And these justice issues have to do with who has standing in court. And then we come into real issues when we talk about seeing climate change through this lens. And one of them is that the harms of climate change are largely to future people. Largely to people who do not yet exist, and who therefore have no standing in terms of court and judicial procedure. How do you represent future people in front of a court? So who are we harming ultimately with climate change? New Orleans is adapting. People who live in Mexico Beach, is that what it's called, down in Florida, where that got wiped off the map. We are spending in the US much, much more money every year for FEMA and for cleaning up from these increasingly common disasters, some of which are fueled by climate change. And we're adapting to this. Is that good enough? That's what would come to court, right? That's what you could litigate, are those kinds of harms. Not the possibility of losing Florida, right? Or Bangladesh, or the delta of the Egyptian Nile, right? So these are things that are really hard to work out in this kind of ethics. A second way of looking at ethics is a kind of calculus, a moral calculus, where you balance the gains against the losses, you assign value to different sorts of things, either through monetary value or things like what's happiness, what provides the best outcome for all. This is something that's used currently quite a bit in terms of adapting to climate change. So an example would be Hurricane Katrina, which wiped out the levee system and exposed other problems with the levee system in New Orleans. And the rebuilding of those levees. Who was at the table? Whose harms were considered to be important? What you see is that New Orleans, the city, is highly protected, but a lot of the Delta communities are left to fend for themselves. So who gets to be at the table, who gets to be part of this calculus is another issue, similar to with the duties and obligations. And you also have the problem of calculating something like place. How, if you look at, say, Bangladesh or other Delta communities, you think about this place being lost and people having to move. But it's not just land that's productive. It's not just something that is economically important. This is a place where people have raised generations of children. This is a place where memories are established. People are connected to land in a fundamental kind of way. And so how do you put a price on the loss of that and the loss of the traditions that go with that land and that place? Who is to say that the island of the Maldives or Tuvalu or other island nations, because they only have, say, 50 or 100,000 people, that's not an important place? And how do we value that as compared to other places? So there's a lot of problems with this kind of moral calculus. And certainly from some perspectives, these things I'm talking about, land and place and home, cannot be calculated. We can't put a price on it. It's not $50,000 or $1 million. And that's not necessarily the way that we think about things in terms of that valuation. So there are issues also with this. And we can talk at length about this type of ethical analysis. It's important and productive, and thinking through these issues is really vital. But I want to suggest to you a third kind of ethical analysis that I think is really more useful. And that's the way that ethics can help us to imagine alternative futures, can help us to get out of the box of having to endlessly calculate and figure out these harms and feel bad about the past and feel guilty. That ethics can do, I think, a lot more than all of this. So let's walk through climate justice for just a second. Again, there's unequal responsibility. It's important to look at numbers here. We've got 13 million people in Pennsylvania. There are 163 million people in Bangladesh. We produce 276 million metric tons of carbon. Bangladesh produces 190 million metric tons. There are lots of ways to think about these numbers, but there's an evident unfairness here. Why should we say to the people of Bangladesh that they don't have the right, for example, to use as much carbon per person as we do? Don't they have the right to develop? And if they did, and in fact they are using increasingly greater amounts of fossil fuels, producing much, much more carbon dioxide, if they continue along this kind of developmental path, is that unjust? Why should we stop then? Especially when you consider that their entire carbon footprint fits within the carbon footprint of our state, not our country, but just our state. So if we cut our carbon footprint in half, we would save space there for Bangladesh to flourish. That would be another way to think about justice in this world. What's a safe number to aim for? 350 parts per million is a number that's thrown out. There's a famous organization called 350.org as saying that this is the goal we should have. We're at 407. We left 350 a long time ago, back in the 80s. And so, can we aim for 450? What would that mean? Every number we choose is accepting a certain amount of harm to occur. Every number we choose is accepting a certain amount of harm. And so, when we choose these numbers here, it's important to recognize these are not choosing degrees. We don't exactly know how sensitive the climate system is to the rise of carbon dioxide, because we have not ever been here before. We have really good evidence about carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere going back 800,000 years, long before there were human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, wandering around. But human civilization goes back maybe 10,000 years, right? 800,000 years of record. It's never gotten higher than 300 parts per million. So we don't know how the climate system is going to respond. So maybe 450 is okay. We have to make that, to stay at 450, that means 80% reduction almost immediately in terms of our carbon footprint. One way to think about this is as a bathtub. And we know what it's going to take to fill that bathtub up to 450 parts per million. If we do that, if we aim at 450 parts per million, who has the right to use up the rest of the bathtub? Is it us? We could do that very quickly, fill up that bathtub, right? Is it Bangladesh and all the other countries that altogether produce very little carbon dioxide and have much larger populations than we do? So these are just as important justice issues to think about. When we think about the calculus, and again, here's an example of the levee system here, the new levee system around New Orleans, including this massive gate that's been produced there to protect the surge coming up through the shipping canal. This is climate change adaptation, right? Dealing with harms that are happening and that we imagine are going to happen. Sea level rise, temperature rise, and weather weirding are the main concerns. Around here, we've seen the latter, right? With the rainfall patterns that have really seriously changed. I mean, ask any farmer, especially locally here in central PA, if you want to hear how things have changed. They're the ones who are most in touch with the weather patterns. And so wiping out of the bridge up in Milesburg, for example, other things like this that are very unusual rainfall patterns. These are things that are starting already to affect us. But temperature rise and sea level rise are more important for other places. Again, for this kind of calculus, who counts? Who gets to be part of that debate? Really important ethical question, something that Nancy Tuana is working on, and part of what's called the SCRIM group here at Penn State, led by Klaus Keller. This is actually working in New Orleans and other places to get people at the table to have these conversations about how to adapt to climate change. Mitigation is part of this as well. So thinking about what some of these future harms might be and how to prevent them from happening. William Nordhaus, I put him up here because he just won the Nobel Prize for economics. Interesting guy who just, again, doing pure economic calculus, says it's better now to start reducing our carbon footprint massively because the costs for that, great as they might be, will be much less than the costs to the economy in the future. So just doing an economic analysis, not thinking about all these other things I was talking about in terms of the value of home and place and all that. So carbon fee and dividend is one of the ways, primary ways that economists are suggesting that we install to move forward. And then there's the question about building resilience. I don't know if you saw this picture from Mexico Beach. I, as a person who likes to build houses, was really fascinated with this. The one house that survived the Hurricane Michael onslaught. There was an article on this in the New York Times, fascinating how they constructed this and why they constructed it this way. It is possible that with building codes, we could have everybody build this way, and so you can survive that kind of onslaught. There are things that we can do, and that probably would be ethical to do, in order to require people who build in these areas to build houses that are capable of surviving the sort of storms that we see to be more common in the future. Now, all of this fits into a concept of sustainable development, which is a real difficult field for a lot of people. Some people want to suggest that there's no such thing as sustainable development, that we have to stop developing. And yet, and this may be true for Mexico Beach, maybe you want to say that they shouldn't build any homes there at all anymore. But how do you tell that to farming communities in Bangladesh, that they can no longer build their homes? I mean, who's going to be responsible for moving all of these people? And what's our responsibility toward them and toward these communities? These are all the kinds of questions that we really need to start addressing. Now, I'm going to talk about the vision thing, and to suggest to you that there's another way of looking at climate change through an ethical lens. And that's this idea of establishing a vision, recentering our sense of what is and what should be. And in this way, it's kind of taking a step back from the pressure of reducing the carbon footprint and responding to hurricanes and all these sorts of things, and just asking fundamental questions about what are we doing here? What's life about? What's our purpose? Of course, religious traditions ask these sorts of questions a lot, but there's no reason that this has to be restricted to religious people. This is something that we can all do, and to think about what is it that we value in life, and where are we trying to go with all of this? And when we do that, we might come up with some different answers than we would have otherwise done. So, we just had a visit, a couple of you I recognized from my students who were there. Has anybody enjoyed the visit of the Tibetan Buddhist monks who have been here? Yeah, so this has been really interesting for me because when they talk about the goal of life in Buddhism, it's very different from our incessant chasing after the next dollar and the latest iPhone, right? That their vision of life is much broader because they think that it's all a matter of dying and rebirth, and that what we do in this life affects our next life, which we'll have, and has been affected by our previous lives. And it's a whole, I'm not suggesting this is true or that you need to believe this. All I want to do is suggest to you that this completely resets our imagination of why we're here and what this is all about and what we should be doing. Similarly, Pope Francis, in his encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si', has anybody read that? I know Leanne has. He completely resets the stage. He says that what we need to do in order to respond to climate change is to listen to the poor and to see how people who have nothing many times have all that's really important in their lives. Sometimes, and he of course worked in the slums in his native Argentina, and he saw that people have close social ties with one another. They depend on one another. And this is true, by the way. If you're ever destitute, don't go to a rich gated community to get help. Okay? Go to the poor section of town. That's where people understand how to help one another and how to reach. I'm really serious. This has actually been proven, right? And people who, and the same thing's true, by the way, I have to throw this in, sorry, about the caravan. Notice how people in Mexico are responding not by bringing out the troops, but by bringing water and food and supporting people as they're walking, right? I mean, that's a response that comes out of a focus on humanity and a focus on social needs and networks. I'm not saying it's good to be poor, because it's not. It's, at a certain level, poverty is really destructive. I'm not trying to paint a picture of poverty as being ideal here. But just as there are things that we can learn from the poor that we should pay attention to. And without having a religious view, thinking about a typical Kantian view of duties, we focus, especially on justice issues, about these things called perfect duties, do not lie, always tell the truth. But there are also a whole range of imperfect duties that Kant suggests. Again, a non-religious way of looking at the world, still that our duties to help one another, our duties to improve ourselves, are things that we need to take seriously and try to build our lives to respond to. And so all of these are ways of recentering what we do. I mean, when you go into the line at Starbucks and you find out that somebody has already paid for your latte, what's your response? I'll pay for the guy behind me. So and that kind of thing, that kind of response is what I'm talking about. You all know what a sacrifice fly is? The sacrifice fly is this great thing in baseball where you're out. You know that they're going to catch the ball and you're out. But your teammate is going to score. So this is the idea of an ethical way of dealing with climate change that I think could be really helpful. The next several years matter intensely. We can think of it as a burden or as of an opportunity. And I'm speaking primarily to the people here who've been born since 1990 in the room. This is really your opportunity to change the world, to really set us on a new path for the future. Because old people, like me, think that we have to live the way that we're living now. As these people here know, I only recently got an electric car. And now I think, I can't imagine driving anything else. But I thought a car had to make a lot of noise and smell bad. I didn't realize that there was an alternative to cars. But if you haven't grown up the way I have with car culture, then you've got an opportunity there to change things. It's going to be a lot easier for you. So maybe it's not even zero carbon emissions. Maybe it's below zero. Maybe that's what we should aim for. Maybe we're the ones with our wealth and resources that can show the way to a better future. So imagine the fact that we have a $600 billion military budget. That's just a crazy amount of money, right? You've got a $20 trillion economy. Just healthcare alone is trillions and trillions of dollars. Imagine if we took some of that money that we're constantly investing in all these other things, and maybe just said, let's take the next 5 years, the next 7 years, let's just start investing that in something else. I'm not suggesting here that military is bad. I'm not taking on healthcare here. I'm just saying maybe we can think about it. Maybe we can put off the national fight against cancer, for example, for 5 or 7 years. We'll pick it up again, but let's just invest that money right now in something different. And so this imagining of the future, which by the way is just at our doorstep, is a way of thinking about a world that we live in is actually better than the world we have now. Thinking about the future in this radically different way. I personally think that Hyperloops are awesome, and I really, really want to ride one. The idea here, right, is that you make these tubes, these pneumatic tubes, that you suck all the air out, and you can zoom a vehicle through it at super high speeds because there's no wind resistance. It's cool, right? The future could be better. It doesn't have to be constantly a matter of worse and worse and worse. Solar roads exist. They're being tried out all over the world. Why not? Why not turn our blacktop into solar energy producers? And so my final point to you is that you can start living this future right now. And you can do it by this. While we've been sitting here, I've been making solar power, by the way, from my phone charger. So it really, with these lights, it's still producing electricity. And I can charge my phones off this. I can charge a lot of things off this kind of thing. You can get a solar backpack. And in that, having this, using that, just carrying these types of things around, you start to model a future for others. These things aren't expensive. That backpack's available for $50 to $60. Right? So think of what you normally spend on these kinds of things and how that step, I mean, this also is, how big is it? 1,300 milliamps? Yeah. 13,000 milliamps, right? Yeah. So this is a really great charger. Okay? So you're not suffering by doing this, is what I'm saying. Get rid of your car. My son, who's 20, by the way, is student at Penn State, not here, so don't look around. It took him forever to get his license. It was so weird. It's like the first thing I wanted to do when I turned 15 was to get my learner's permit. Again, generational difference. A lot of young people aren't that into driving and that into owning cars. Don't do it. Do car sharing, right? Do Uber. Find a way around. get out of this system, because there are other systems that are possible. And in the process, you can explore what we have as a great bus system, for example. There it goes. And then what I think is the coolest thing, all over campus, I was talking to the guy on one just yesterday, are these electric skateboards. And they really work, because it gets 10 miles on this electric skateboard. So you don't have to give up mobility. You don't have to give up coolness. You can redefine these concepts and live in a much lower, zero carbon world. Encourage your parents to downsize. Take your convictions and spread them out. Best way to start is with your own family. I just downsized my mom from the ancestral home, and in the process we got rid of literally boatloads of stuff. It was unbelievable. It saves you time later, trust me, it's much easier to do it now. And the notion again, redefine your idea of what's necessary and what's possible. And once you work on your family, don't stop there. Work on your university, your town, your state. Washington State right now has a referendum that they're going to establish a carbon tax. Just Washington State. They're not waiting for the national government to change, right? And so this is the kind of response you can do locally, working with other people right here in the room, your own cohort, figuring out the different social networks that you have, and making your impact much larger. So, thanks very much, and look forward to any questions you might have.
Are there any questions? We have time for a few.
So I really love all of these ideas, but I've also seen data that talks about big business being the really crucial problem here. Are there ways that students or younger people can advocate in some of those fields or spaces as well to help with this problem?
Thanks, Penn. Absolutely. So, big business is interesting, and Lydia Vandenberg, who's here, was a speaker on this just last year, telling us that maybe big business isn't entirely the enemy, and we should pay attention to those businesses that have gone carbon neutral, and ones that are using their buying power to put up solar panels and to move forward. We can break down carbon footprints by individual, by state, by country. We can also break them down by businesses. And you consider Google, for instance, they use a lot of electricity. They are, as far as I know, is this right? They're 100% carbon neutral? Yeah. So they've offset all of that electrical production already. And so the other aspect of this is to use your buying power to learn about the businesses that are responding to global warming and that are making a difference, and support those businesses. You're absolutely right about things like barley, about losing the hemlock tree, which is our state tree, for instance, with You can also talk about the sugar maple, which is going to keep moving farther north as the climate changes around here. These are really depressing ideas, and even if you can convince people that they're true, you're ultimately working with a set of negativities. And one way to get an end run around this is, therefore, to start imagining these positive things. And this is something that comes up from my experience teaching students in my Ethics of Climate Change course, is that students really don't want to hear about rising sea levels in Bangladesh. And they don't really necessarily, I hate to say this, so I'm sorry to vilify an entire class, but students basically don't know where Bangladesh is. We have trouble finding it on a map. It's true, right? You admit it, it's true. I know it's true because I also teach Islamic history, so I know students don't know these things. And so trying to have empathy for this place that's far away that you don't even know and you don't understand is so much harder than thinking about a possible future that is better and it's cooler and it's more fun. I don't think ethically we can get rid of that downside. I think we have to deal with that, and we have to inform people about where Bangladesh is and why it matters. But at the same time, messaging in a way that's more positive and that imagines a better future, I think especially for young people, is something that gets them excited and involved. So that's kind of my way around that. Yes, I think she's bringing the microphone for you.
Well, I think we need to really look at the mass transit system very, very carefully and find some way in the government to give people the opportunity to go from one place to another as inexpensively and as really easily for everyone, instead of it depending on the personal car. I think you can take the example of going up to Cornell.
Mm-hmm.
If you go up to Cornell, it's a nice trip if you buy a car. But if you wanted to go to Cornell or Ithaca up there on a bus, you would have to go all the way east, about maybe 150 miles to get a bus up to Ithaca.
Right.
Now this is ridiculous.
Right, I agree.
Why in God's name have the various bus systems not made it easier to go places by bus? And also, what about the old post roads that had nice little restaurants in them? You don't have that if you go on a bus.
Right.
I used to go up to Toronto quite a bit, and it's miserable, you know, in Buffalo. The crud you have to get in the bus place is horrible. We won't
Right, so let me
we won't
answer
go
your
into
question.
what it's like
Right.
across the border.
Yeah. No, we can talk about trains in the same way, right? There used to be a train that came to State College. Weird, right? But there was a train in State College in Belfont. There used to be train service, right? There are and there were alternatives to the way that we think about transportation. But what's clear is that mobility is important to people. Nobody wants to live in a world where you just have to stay home in order to reduce your carbon footprint. So we have to imagine a sense of mobility that allows us that freedom of movement and yet doesn't have the same kind of carbon impact. If we as a country put the same amount of money into a train or a hyperloop system that we put into maintaining roads, for example, that we put into pipelines, gas pipelines, oil pipelines, that we have to stop using, right? We would really have quite a different world. And the other way to think about this is that it doesn't have to be either or. You don't have to get rid of the car in order to have public transportation. We don't have to do these things. We can have both of those. If, again, we think about what's important to human beings. I I don't see why Tesla should be the only company in the world that's investing in a supercharger system. Why don't we have superchargers that electric cars, non-Tesla electric cars, why don't they exist on the highway? Why aren't they set up at every rest stop, for example? Right now, cars have arranged to make that trip from here to Ithaca without any trouble at all. Go to Ithaca, charge up, come back. Easy. It's possible with our existing technology. You don't have to invent anything new in order to get that kind of mobility already. But we could have a hybrid, right? We could have these other systems if we prioritize them.
I have a general question.
Yeah.
Do the electric cars, though, like bring on more taxes and stuff for us citizens to pay? Because then that might be a roadblock if people are trying to, if all of us are trying to convert that way.
Right, so you're talking about the gas tax, I think?
Yeah, basically we'll pay for that.
Right now there's a fuel-based gas tax that pays for, makes a big contribution toward road building. Is that what you're referring to?
I just like the Tesla cars and stuff, like
Yeah.
you said, like supercharging them and stuff.
Yeah.
Does that create more taxes for citizens if we all kind of convert to those kinds of?
I think we're talking about creativity here and the need to think outside the box. Somehow when it comes to taxation, our legislators are really creative. I'm pretty sure they'll find a way to adjust the taxes so that they'll get the money they need. Just saying. But we already pay a tax as electric car owners, right? Go ahead.
So I can speak a little bit on that. So some states, what they have done.
Speak up, Mike.
Why don't you stand up?
Yeah, thank you.
So some states, what they have done to address that fact is when you do your annual registration on your vehicles, they make you report your odometer. So if you have an electric vehicle, they look at how many miles that you've traveled, then your registration isn't just $36 or $42, whatever it is in the state now. It's that flat fee plus the number of miles that you've driven your vehicle, then they consider that as part of the tax, and then you have to pay a little bit more to register your car since you're using the roads. So, but yeah, that is a legitimate concern a lot of states are coming up against.
Right. Right now, electric vehicles make up just a tiny percentage of total vehicles, so we're not at that stage yet. Let's get there, so that we have to have that problem. It's a good problem to have. Any other questions?
Awesome. Well, if anyone else has any further questions,
Stick around.
yeah, John will stick around for a few minutes so you can go to him. But thank you so much for coming. It's really important to look at these big issues from a different perspective. Looking forward, next week we have an off week, so the following week we have Chris Yule, who is the infamous professor of Sci 3 here at Penn State, so you can join us for that. But thank you guys so much for coming.
Was that always planned to be an off? Was next week always planned to be an off week? Thanksgiving break? Next week is not Thanksgiving break, you know.